A sword fell. A man kicked. A rope pulled tight. The crowd cheered, but she did not. Somewhere above the scaffold, hidden behind stone and shadow, a queen screamed, not from pain, not from injury, but from something far worse, the moment when power made her watch. This was not justice. It was punishment for her. The condemned was not just a man. He was the person she had once risked her crown for, the man she had ruled beside, perhaps even loved. And now he was dying in public, deliberately, slowly, beneath her eyes because someone wanted her to see it. In the long, blood-soaked history of royal executions, there are tales of rebellion, betrayal, even redemption. But few contain a cruelty as precise and as personal as this. The execution of Roger Mortimer in 1330 wasn't just the silencing of a traitor, it was the destruction of a queen's will. Because on that scaffold, it wasn't just a body that was broken, it was a bond. What happens when a mother who reshaped kingdoms is forced to witness the undoing of everything she built? What does it mean when a son, once sheltered under her crown, decides the most effective way to seize power is to break the very heart that put him on the throne? This is not a story about good and evil. It is not a tale of heroes and villains. This is a story about silence being weaponized, about grief turned into a stage play, about a young king proving that no loyalty, not even a mother's, is sacred in the shadow of power. And the most chilling part, the crowd didn't know they were watching two people die. Only one had a rope around his neck. But the other, the woman clenching a windowsill so tightly her nails split, was being executed in spirit. This is the story of Queen Isabella of France, the she-wolf whose fangs were not pulled out, but turned inward. And the man she watched die was more than her ally. He was her escape, her partner, her undoing. This is the execution that wasn't meant to kill a man. It was meant to kill a legacy, and someone made sure she didn't just witness it, they made sure she remembered it forever. She was born into power, but forged in disappointment. Isabella of France entered the world in 1295 as the daughter of King Philip IV, one of the most calculating and feared monarchs in medieval Europe. Her bloodline was impeccable, her education refined, and her political value undeniable. From the moment she could walk, she wasn't just a child, she was a chess piece. And at the age of just 12, that piece was moved across the Channel to marry the King of England. On paper, it was a brilliant alliance, France and England bound through royal blood. But in practice, it was the beginning of a long, slow unraveling, a marriage that would become one of the most tragic and politically explosive in medieval history. Because Edward II, the man Isabella was sent to love, had already given his heart to someone else. His name was Piers Gaveston, and later, Hugh Despenser. Both were male favorites of the kingmen who were elevated far beyond their station, granted power, land, and affection, while Isabella, the rightful queen, was left to smile in silence. To the court, she was ornamental, present, but powerless. But Isabella was not a pawn. Not really. She watched, she endured, and in time, she adapted. What makes her story so haunting is not that she was betrayed, it's that she was clever enough to survive it. She wasn't the first queen to be sidelined, but she might have been the first to strike back with such devastating precision. To understand the fire that would one day burn through England's monarchy, you must first understand the ice in which it was trapped. Isabella's early years as queen were marked by humiliation. Her household was reduced, her requests denied. Her husband ignored her, then insulted her, placing her beneath the men he favored. Foreign ambassadors whispered about it. Nobles grumbled, but Isabella remained outwardly calm, until one day, she stopped waiting for rescue and decided to become the storm. She fled to France under the guise of diplomacy, but returned with an army. And at her side was a man who would become both her sword and her downfall, Roger Mortimer. Together, they launched a coup against Edward II. Together, they broke the old regime. And together, they placed Isabella's 14-year-old son, Edward of Windsor, on the throne. It should have been her moment of triumph. She had overthrown a king, protected her son, and reclaimed the voice that had been denied to her for years. But what began as liberation soon became entrapment of a different kind. Because in ruling England through her young son, Isabella and Mortimer made enemies powerful ones. And the very boy she placed on the throne would soon become the sharpest blade pointed at her heart. Edward of Windsor, now King Edward III, was no longer a child for long. He watched the court. He listened to the whispers, and he began to resent the way his mother and Mortimer made decisions in his name. As his authority grew, so did his hunger to rule on his own terms, and in that growing shadow, Isabella's past her rebellion, her power. Her love for Mortimer became liabilities. What began as a mother's desperate attempt to reclaim dignity had planted the seeds of her own destruction. But let's be clear, Isabella was not some hysterical villain, nor a helpless victim. She was a woman of remarkable intellect, political calculation, and fierce maternal devotion. She didn't just endure the brutal world of medieval politics, she learned how to play it better than most men around her. And yet, the cost of that mastery was everything. Her legacy would not be measured in victories, but in the silence that followed them. Because the boy she raised to become a king didn't just take the throne. He took her voice, her love, and the one man who helped her survive. So who was Isabella of France? She was a queen who learned too late that in a world ruled by men, a woman who seizes power must never let it go, because the moment she does, they won't just take it back. They'll make her watch. Power always invites betrayal, but in medieval England, betrayal didn't come with a dagger in the dark. It came with a crown in daylight. After Isabella overthrew her husband Edward II and installed her teenage son as king, it looked like her story had reached its victorious peak. The queen who had once been silenced was now the voice behind the throne. And beside her stood Roger Mortimer, a man who had been more than her ally. He had been her weapon, her strategy, her survival. But as history shows us time and again, when rebels win, they rarely know how to stop fighting. Together, Isabella and Mortimer had torn the old regime apart. Now, they would make the fatal mistake of ruling like the very tyrants they had dethroned. Mortimer was no fool. He knew the game of power because he had spent years losing it. Born into nobility, he had fought on the chaotic Welsh borderlands, served in court, rebelled, been captured, and then escaped the Tower of London in a daring flight that turned him into a legend. By the time he met Isabella in France, he wasn't just a fugitive, he was a man forged in fire, and he carried with him the scars of ambition denied. When they returned to England in 1326, it wasn't just for justice. It was revenge dressed in royal colors. At first, the new regime dazzled. The people cheered. The hated dispensers were executed in brutal, unforgettable fashion. Isabella and Mortimer were hailed as liberators. But power has a way of rotting the same hands that earn it. Within a year, Mortimer began acting not like a regent, but like a king. He amassed land at an alarming pace. He surrounded himself with guards. He issued commands in the name of the young Edward III without consulting him. And he did something worse than overreach. He reminded everyone of the men he had just destroyed. To the lords and parliamentarians who had once welcomed change, Mortimer now looked frighteningly familiar. As for Isabella, she did not stop him. Whether out of love, dependence, or hubris, she let Mortimer rule unchecked. The woman who had once outmaneuvered kings now watched as her new partner made enemies everywhere. Rumors swirled that Mortimer had helped murder Edward II, killed in secret. His screams silenced in the depths of Berkeley Castle. Whether true or not didn't matter. What mattered was the perception, and perception was turning against them. Meanwhile, Edward III, still legally under his mother's guardianship, was no longer the pliable boy Mortimer assumed. He had watched in silence for years, his letters read, his movements restricted, his crown worn in name only. But he was growing stronger, smarter, and far more dangerous. He didn't need to shout. He just needed to wait. The conflict wasn't loud, it was cold. It built in glances, in silences, in tension at court. Mortimer ruled in daylight, but Edward planned in shadows. And when the moment came, it was surgical, a midnight raid through a secret passage at Nottingham Castle. Mortimer was seized. Isabella was detained. No army stood in their defense. No allies came to stop the fall, because by the time the blade came down, the throne had already turned against them. This was no longer the story of a queen who won power. It was becoming the story of how power slipped through her fingers. And for Mortimer, it would be the beginning of a very public end. Power taken on your behalf is still power stolen. And Edward III had waited long enough. At just 14, Edward had worn a crown placed on his head not by his will, but by the ambition of others, his mother, Isabella, and her partner, Roger Mortimer. For years, he had smiled for the court, bowed to their commands, and signed documents prepared by hands that weren't his. But beneath the royal robes, a storm was building, because this young king was watching everything. He saw how Mortimer governed like a monarch in all but name. He heard the whispers about his father's mysterious death, perhaps orchestrated in secret by the very people claiming to protect him. And most importantly, he recognized the truth: he was no king at all. He was a puppet in a crown of lies. But Edward was his mother's son. He had learned patience from her silence, and strategy from her rebellion. Where others might have lashed out, he waited. He watched Mortimer grow arrogant, claiming lands, punishing rivals, issuing decrees with royal flair. He watched his mother grow complicit, allowing Mortimer to reshape the monarchy in their image, not his. The teenage boy they had once controlled was becoming a young man with the blood of Plantagenets and Capeus running hot in his veins. And when he decided to move, it would be quiet but absolute. The night of October 19th, 1330 changed everything. Under cover of darkness, Edward and a small band of loyal knights infiltrated Nottingham Castle through a hidden passage still remembered in English legend as Mortimer's Hole. It was a secret tunnel, built for escape, but used that night for conquest. In a matter of moments, Roger Mortimer, the most powerful man in England, was dragged from his chamber in shock and chains. Isabella, caught completely off guard, was placed under custody. There was no public resistance, no civil war, because by that point, no one feared Mortimer more than the king they had once underestimated. What followed was not a mere transition of power. It was a theatrical reversal, one designed to erase an entire chapter of England's monarchy. Mortimer was stripped of titles and prepared for a show trial, but the verdict had already been written. Edward didn't just want him gone, he wanted him remembered as a warning. And Isabella, she was spared execution, but not punishment. Her son had taken back the throne not with rage, but with performance. Mortimer would die, but she would be made to watch. This was the moment where the boy disappeared, and the king emerged. Not with fanfare, but with calculation. Not with mercy, but with message. Edward III didn't simply reclaim power, he claimed narrative. Every decision that followed the arrest, the trial, the execution was designed to declare the era of guardianship was over, and the king no longer shared his crown. And in reclaiming his throne, Edward did something far colder than revenge. He turned love into leverage. He didn't just break his enemies, he broke the people who had made him. Because for Edward III, ruling meant more than seizing a scepter. It meant erasing every shadow cast over it. Even if that shadow was his own mother, death was inevitable. But what Edward III wanted was theater. Roger Mortimer's execution on November 29th, 1330 was never meant to be just a legal conclusion. It was a carefully scripted performance of retribution, humiliation, and absolute dominance. The message wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. The king wasn't just removing a traitor. He was rewriting his own origin story, one where he wasn't a boy manipulated by others, but a monarch who had conquered betrayal with poise and precision. And he needed everyone to see it. He needed her to see it. The trial was a formality. No defense allowed. No evidence weighed. 35 charges were read aloud like drumbeats in a funeral march, each one slicing deeper into Mortimer's public image, usurping regal power, forging documents, endangering the life of the king, and most damningly participating in the rumored murder of Edward II, the king's own father. It didn't matter whether it was true. Truth wasn't the goal. Memory was. But the most brutal part of this execution wasn't the rope. It was the audience. Isabella of France. The woman who had once ruled beside Mortimer was not permitted to speak on his behalf. She was not even formally acknowledged, but sources suggest she was made to be near close enough to hear, to feel, and perhaps to see. Some accounts claim she was placed at a private window overlooking the scaffold. Others say she was hidden behind a lattice screen. But all agree on one thing: Edward wanted her to absorb every second. Mortimer was stripped of his noble status. There would be no dignified beheading, no sword, no honor. Instead, he was to be hanged like a thief publicly, slowly, and beneath the judgment of thousands. He wore coarse, common cloth. His head was bare. His name, once whispered with fear, was now shouted with venom. The scaffold was raised high above the crowd, not for the sake of visibility but for spectacle. Even the cold wind of late November was a part of the script, sharpening pain, slowing death. And then came the silence. A thick, deliberate pause before the noose tightened. The executioner waited not because he was unsure, but because he had been told to. This was the king's moment. A final breath, a final glance, maybe even a final plea that never came. And somewhere in that stillness, perhaps in a nearby tower window, Isabella watched. The man she had fought beside, the man she had trusted, the man she may have loved. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He looked to the sky and dropped. His body convulsed. The rope held. The crowd murmured. Some cheered, some looked away. And somewhere behind stone and guards and royal silence, a queen shattered. Because the death on that scaffold wasn't just of a man. It was of her era, her rebellion, her legacy. It was the last stroke in a portrait of Erasure Edward III had painted with brutal clarity. Mortimer's body swung in the cold air, but the real weight was felt in the silence that followed. This wasn't just an execution. It was a message carved into bone. The king no longer shared power, and love, no matter how fierce, no matter how once victorious, had no place in his kingdom. Some executions don't end with a death, they begin with one. And for Queen Isabella of France, Roger Mortimer's final breath was the first moment of her own slow, silent undoing. After the scaffold was dismantled and Mortimer's body cut down, England moved on, publicly, at least. The traitor was gone, the throne restored, the people pacified. But one figure lingered in the political shadows: the Queen Mother. The woman who had once brought down a king, installed another, and ruled England through fire and force, was now treated as if she had never existed. No charges were read against her, no trial, no execution, no exile by name. But Isabella was convicted in a way far more insidious: by silence. Edward III understood something most kings learn too late: removing a threat is not enough. You must erase it. And so began the quiet burial of Isabella's legacy, done not with swords, but with distance, memory, and control. She was placed in honorable confinement at Castle Rising in Norfolk, a remote estate far from court, far from power, and far from the son she had once crowned with her own hands. It was not a prison in chains, but a prison of reputation. Her attendants were loyal not to her, but to the king. Her letters were read, her voice muted. Officially, she was in retreat, a queen seeking piety, a mother removed from public life for her own well-being. But everyone at court understood the truth: this was punishment by omission, a slow erasure of a woman too dangerous to kill and too scandalous to celebrate. The same queen who had once ridden at the head of an army now walked in silence through windswept halls, her footsteps muffled by history's disinterest. Isabella lived this way for nearly 30 years, not dead, but disappearing piece by piece, title by title, memory by memory. Foreign ambassadors inquired after her. They were told she was well. Chroniclers barely mentioned her name. When they did, it was with caution or contempt. The she-wolf of France had become a ghost in her own lifetime, a relic hidden behind courtesy phrases and locked doors. And yet, within the stone walls of Castle Rising, she held on to what little she had left. A few books in French, some tapestries from her youth, and, according to some accounts, a small illuminated manuscript once belonging to Mortimer himself. She never spoke his name again. Not in public, not to her attendants, but memory is not always spoken aloud. Sometimes it survives in silence, and that silence sharp, bitter, and echoing was where Isabella lived. Edward III, for his part, never visited her. He allowed no grand reconciliation, no public forgiveness. When Mortimer died, so did every thread that tied Isabella to the center of power. She was not executed because her suffering was more useful alive. Her existence became a warning that those who overstep even queens can be unwritten without a blade. When she finally died in 1358, she was buried modestly, dressed in the habit of a nun. Whether that was her choice or imposed penitence, no one can say. Her funeral was quiet. No royal procession, no national mourning, no mention of the man who had died before her, or the son who had banished her. Just dirt. Just silence. Because the execution Edward staged didn't end on the scaffold, it echoed for decades, through absence, through memory, through a mother made invisible. And that may be the most ruthless sentence of all. History remembers kings, but it rarely forgives queens who dared to rule. The story of Isabella of France is not simply a tragedy. It is a lesson carved into silence, written between the lines of official chronicles and buried beneath the weight of royal pride. When Roger Mortimer was executed and Isabella erased from public life, Edward III didn't just restore the monarchy, he controlled its memory. What followed wasn't just punishment. It was narrative warfare, and Edward knew exactly how to win. He understood a truth as modern as it is. Medieval power is not only about what happens, but what is remembered and, more importantly, what is allowed to be forgotten. Mortimer's body received no monument. Isabella's name was scrubbed from state records. Their political achievements, their crimes, their passion all folded into a whisper that no one at court dared speak aloud. And yet, centuries later, their story survives. Why? Because the human heart refuses to forget what power tries to bury. We remember Isabella not because the history books preserved her, but because her silence speaks louder than any proclamation. We remember her because she makes us ask the questions that haunt every era: who gets to tell the story, who decides what was right, and what price must be paid for challenging the script. There is something distinctly American about this struggle. Our culture values individualism, rebellion, and the fight for justice against corrupt systems. Isabella's arc from obedient bride to revolutionary queen to silenced exile resonates with anyone who has ever been punished for stepping outside the role society assigned them. She was a woman who dared to hold power in a man's world, who dared to love, to scheme, to rule. And when the tide turned, she wasn't defeated with swords, she was drowned in silence. But silence is not the same as peace. For nearly 30 years, Isabella lived with her memories. The army she led, the king she dethroned, the man she may have loved, swinging lifeless from a rope while she was forced to watch. And perhaps worst of all, the son she had protected, who rose not just by surpassing her, but by destroying her. That is the tragedy at the heart of this story, not the fall of a queen, but the deliberate crushing of a mother's identity in the name of royal narrative. What can we take from this first? That power without empathy becomes cruelty. Edward III was a brilliant ruler, but his rise came at the cost of something deeply human: compassion. In his pursuit of control, he turned his mother's love into leverage and her grief into propaganda. That is a warning to every generation: when legacy becomes more important than love, we lose our humanity. Second, that truth is fragile. It can be twisted, hidden, and rewritten by those who hold the pen, but it can also be resurrected by those who choose to look deeper. The story of Isabella and Mortimer survived not because it was celebrated, but because it refused to die. In a world filled with propaganda, censorship, and curated timelines, this reminds us that we must question the official version, especially when silence is louder than the story itself. And finally, there's this: no matter how carefully the past is erased, memory finds a way. A widow's whisper, a manuscript kept in a locked chamber, a chronicler daring to scribble the forbidden name. The truth lives on not in monuments, but in the cracks, and it speaks to us now more than ever. Isabella's story is not just a footnote in medieval drama. It is a mirror held up to our own world, one where reputation can be crafted, memory weaponized, and power passed down like a crown polished by denial. But even in exile, even in silence, a single voice can haunt a kingdom. And that's something no king can kill. If this story moved you, if Isabella's silence, Mortimer's fall, or Edward's ruthless rise made you feel anything, don't let it end here. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in her place? Save this video so you never forget how power rewrites history. And if you want more untold stories, more hidden betrayals, more dark truths they never taught in school, hit that subscribe button. Because history isn't dead, it's waiting to be uncovered. And we're just getting started.